Bible makes it clear that Jesus has dealt with the issue of sin on the cross. He is the perfect sacrifice for sin for all time, for all who believe. So why are we as Christians still tempted to sin? And how do we deal with that temptation? Today on Truth for Life Weekend, Alistair Begg explores the answers found in the book of James, chapter 1.
A couple of years ago, I was playing golf in Scotland with one of my friends. And in the course of a round of golf, we were speaking about just about everything. A young man, very successful in business. I've known him since he was a 16-year-old youth. I married him to his wife. I watched him develop and grow, and not only in terms of his physical stature, but also in terms of his business acumen. By the time we were playing golf together, he had risen to the absolute top of his profession within the context of the United Kingdom. Highly successful and probably 10 years my junior. In the course of it all, I asked him, how do you do on business trips? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, how do you handle going in and out of those hotels, being away from your wife and your children? Oh, he said, it's okay. We talked a little bit about that and how important I found it to make certain precautionary moves in relationship to those things. And as we spoke, we covenanted with one another in a kind of awesome way that if ever we were tempted to let our wives or our families down or our testimony down, that we would immediately contact one another. And if we failed to contact one another, that we would take a 3-wood and do something harmful to the other person with it. That doesn't sound particularly Christian, but that was what I said. I think I said something like, if you ever mess up, I'll take this 3-wood and crack you on the side of the head with it. Well, in a strange turn of events that I won't go into, my wife suggested the other day that I ask this fellow and his wife to send something from Scotland, a medical supply that was important for somebody who was undergoing radiation treatment. And so I called the home and asked if they would send this particular thing. And I have sisters and family there. It was an interesting thing. My wife would even suggest that I call this person, but I did, being a good, obedient husband. And as a result of that, within about a week, the supplies came. And with the supplies came a note from the wife in which she said, X has told me that he can no longer tell me that he loves me completely because he has a strong affection for another girl. Please help me. So I sent him a fax. It needed to be cryptic because it was going right into his office. It said, Dear X, you remember what I said I'd do if, quotes, this, close quotes, ever happened. I got a fax back from him. I'm not going to tell you the story. That's not why I'm here this morning. But suffice it to say that this guy, despite all of his background, despite all of his convictions, despite all of his protestations, proved to be no stronger than necessarily you or I may prove to be in the face of an amazing onslaught of temptation. And I want to take the moments that I have this morning to speak to you about temptation. The source of my material is James chapter 1. And I'm going to read a couple of verses from verse 12. Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, because when he has stood the test, he will receive the victor's crown, the life God has promised to those who love him. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he's dragged away and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. When we come to faith in Jesus Christ and the bonds of sin are broken in our experience and we're transferred from death to life, we're indwelt by the Spirit of God, we're placed within His family, we are redeemed, we are changed, we are born again, sin no longer reigns in our lives, but it remains in our lives. And consequently, in the words of the Westminster Shorter Catechism, the Christian, from the point of conversion through to the point of seeing Christ and being made like Him, is involved in a continual and irreconcilable war. That we are not, upon redemption, moved onto some level of ease whereby we are exempt from the rigors of sin and from the attacks of the evil one and from the subtle tendencies of our own hearts. And one of the things that has been striking me most forcibly as I seek to make my own way through my Christian pilgrimage, as I follow after Christ, and as I listen to the things that are being said, and as I observe the tendencies and drifts of our culture, I'm fearful that there is a prevailing notion that is beginning to become widespread in the present generation. And it is an unbelievable naivety as it relates to the question of indwelling sin. A kind of willful stupidity that has more to do with how we feel than it has to do with how we act. That lives with the notion that somehow or another it's all going to be okay because it's all going to be okay. Or it's all going to be fine because that was a wonderful service I attended the other day, and I think I'm going to be able to live on the strength of that for some time. It'll be able to keep me buoyant. I feel strong as a result of it. And when we begin to position ourselves in that way, we lay ourselves open to great danger. Now, the issue of temptation is something that the Scriptures are replete with warnings about. Let us say that temptation this morning, for want of a succinct definition, is an enticement to sin and evil. That's what we're talking about when we talk about temptation. It is the enticement to sin and to evil. Not simply to do things which are wild and unthinkable. Not to enter into spheres of activity that are just way beyond our imagining, but even to take good things which God has given us and to use them or to misuse them in a way that sins against God. So, for example, the enjoyment of food becomes the sin of gluttony. The beauty of marriage becomes the ugliness of adultery. The enjoyment of companionship with someone of the opposite sex becomes the sin of fornication, and so we could go on. Let's allow the Scriptures to say three things concerning temptation this morning. I'm going to go through them briefly. Number one, from verse 13, God is never and cannot be the source of temptation. That's what he says in verse 13. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. There's an inescapable logic here in James' statement. He doesn't go into philosophical discussions of the problem of evil, but he builds this statement on the character of God. God is incapable of tempting others to evil because he himself is absolutely insusceptible to evil. Tempting others to evil would require a delight in evil of which God is incapable. Oh, but says a bright spark out there, doesn't it say that God tempted Abraham? Doesn't it say that God tempted others? Well, depending on the translation of the Bible that you're using, it may well say that. Another translation may say that God tested Abraham. But here's the distinction. Here's the explanation for the phrase in the Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation. God's tempting or testing, unlike the devil's, is a test in which he does not desire the candidate, namely you or I, to fail, but to succeed. When God brings us into an experience in our lives of testing, when we experience tempting which he allows, God's purpose in that is not our failure, but it is our benefit. In direct contrast to that, the evil one's antagonism towards us is always to bring us down, always to defeat and always to discourage and to destroy. So the first thing about which we need to be very clear when we think in terms of temptation is that God is never and cannot be the source of an enticement to evil. Secondly, in verse 14, temptation begins with our individual desires. Each one is tempted when by his own evil desire. What is James suggesting here? That all our desires are evil? No, clearly not. We have all kinds of desires which are not evil. But as a result of the fall, all of our desires have an amazing, unhappy potential for evil. So even God-given capacities and God-given desires, because we live in a fallen world, and because although in Christ sin no longer reigns, it remains, even our best desires, our God-given appetites, have the potential for evil. And there is no time in your life, young person, when we will be exempt from temptation. I guess I had the notion when I sat where you sit and listened to old men like me talk, that presumably the only way they could talk as they did was that they had passed some kind of magical point on the spiritual pilgrimage, and they were now beyond all these heinous realms in which I was living as a student. Well, that was pure stupidity on my part. I know that now because I've lived through those phases, and here I am this morning to tell you that I agree with McShane. I've discovered that the seeds of every sin reside in my heart. And that if I'm not clear about the nature of temptation and how to deal with it, I'm as susceptible as the next fellow. And I don't want to be another statistic in the news page of Christianity today. But let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he falls. So let's be realistic. We are tempted when we are pulled away by our own evil desires. God says to Cain in Genesis 4:7 in a graphic verse, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it. Wonderful picture, a telling picture, good picture to keep in mind. It is crouching at the door, ready to pounce as an assailant. And says God to Cain, it desires to have you, but you must master it. We're tempted to explain away our propensities for evil on the basis of the devil made me do it, or on the basis of our peers, oh, my friends are a dreadful bunch, or on the basis of heredity, which may or may not be true incidentally, on the basis of heredity or on the basis of environment. But what does the Bible say? Each one is tempted when by his own evil desire. His own evil desire. In other words, there are propensities that are unique to you, and they are unique to me. There are certain things that we share in common, but there are areas in your life that you know about, and I don't know about, and I don't need to know about. But the fact that you know about them and the Spirit of God puts His hand upon them, even in a message like this morning, is significant for you. In the same way that we all have different faces and we all have different capacities and gifts, so there are certain things that may be particularly prevalent in our experience. For all of us, the temptation to disobey God, the temptation to discouragement, to give up, to chuck it. And if you've made it successfully through all these terms here and you've never been tempted to chuck it, you ought to stand up in a prayer meeting and give that testimony, because people are going to be all ears. You're not old enough to remember Neil Young's song Out on a Weekend, but it starts, think I'll pack it in, buy a pickup, take it down to L.A. Sometimes I play that thing and I say, that sounds jolly good to me. I'd like to run for it. I'd like to buy a pickup, pack it in, and head for Los Angeles. Doesn't that sound not bad? The temptation to chuck it, the temptation to indulge our evil desires, all of these things emerge from inside of us. Jesus made that perfectly clear. Mark chapter 7. You know these verses before you turn to them. After he had left the crowd, verse 17, and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. Are you so dull, he asked? Don't you see that nothing that enters a man from the outside can make him unclean? For it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach, and then out of his body. He went on, what comes out of a man is what makes him unclean. For from within, out of men's hearts come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and make a man unclean. Every sin is an inside job. You understand that? The devil comes and entices you to evil, but every time you and I sin, it's because we made the decision to sin on the inside. We open the door. We face the crossroads. We decide. And every temptation that comes to us comes when by our own evil desire we are dragged away and enticed by it. When we are tempted, never say, God tempt us, because he can't tempt to evil. Secondly, recognize that temptation comes about when we are enticed, verse 14, by our own evil desire. And thirdly, realize this, that temptation succumb to leads eventually to death. In verse 12 of James 1, James has given a process that leads to life, and now in verse 15, he gives a process that leads to death. Inner craving demands action, which either has to be acted on or resisted. We understand that in the physical realm, don't we? You open the refrigerator door. You've got an inner craving. You're not sure what it's for, except it is for food. You pull the door open. They've made it so that it immediately lights up and looks very attractive. Half of you says, I really shouldn't eat any of this junk. And then someone says, it's not junk. There's a lot of good things in here you can kill yourself with. And so the battle goes on. Battle goes on. And the light is there, and the cartons are attractive, and the cheese looks good, and all that stuff. And the inner craving has to be acted upon. You either grab it and you eat it, or you close the door and you walk from it. The process is here. Sow a thought. Did I tell you this before? Sow a thought, reap an action. Sow an action, reap a habit. Sow a habit, reap a character. Sow a character, reap a destiny. Now, in the final 5 minutes that I have, let me give you 3 practical words concerning how to deal with temptation. Let me give you 3 words. How should I deal with temptation? Number 1, immediately. Immediately. The time to deal with temptations is in their beginnings. Desires and passions grow as rivers do. They are like rust which, left to itself, eats away unceasingly. You have to appoint the moral sentries for your life. The great contrast between 2 Samuel 11 is found in Genesis 39 in the story of Joseph and the wife of Potiphar, remember? And Joseph was determined to deal with every encroaching advancement of sin. And he dealt with it not in relationship to how the situation would make him feel, nor did he deal with it in relationship to who would know or who wouldn't know, but he dealt with it in relationship to what sin would do to God. How can I do this dreadful thing, he says to Potiphar's wife, and sin against God? Are you dealing with stuff immediately when it rears its ugly head? Or are you playing with it? Like the fish playing with a bait? Secondly, deal with it ruthlessly. Ruthlessly. That's what Jesus was teaching in Matthew chapter 5. He says, if you got a problem with your eyes, you'd be better to pull one of your eyes out and go into heaven with one eye than go into hell with 2 eyes. You'd be better to chop one of your hands off and go into heaven with one hand than go into hell with 2. You'd be better to remove one of your feet and hop into heaven than lumber into hell. That's kind of ruthless talk, isn't it? I mean, that's radical. The children's chorus gets it good, doesn't it? Oh, be careful, little feet, where you go. Oh, be careful, little feet, where you go. There's a Father up above, and He's looking down in love. So be careful, little feet, where you go. Immediately, ruthlessly, and finally, consistently. Consistently. It's a daily battle. It's a 60 seconds a minute battle. Oh, we have the power and the energy of the Spirit of God within our lives. We're not going to neglect that, nor should we diminish it in any way. It is essential, working out our own salvation with fear and trembling. But nevertheless, this is what it means. It means the refusal to allow our eyes to wander, our minds to contemplate, our affections to run after anything which draws us away from Christ. At the first indication of its attraction. I spoke to this guy's wife on the phone yesterday afternoon, and she's 3,500 miles away. And she said, don't I remember you saying to X that you told the guys in your pastoral team that if ever they were looking forward to a counseling appointment with a girl who was coming to see them, that they ought to have somebody else take the counseling appointment? I said, that's right, I said that. And we hold one another to that. Why? Because sin is crouching at the door. It desires to have you, but you must master it. Immediately, ruthlessly, and consistently. And loved ones, the decisions that you are making in these areas this morning, and the commitments that you make to follow through in your afternoons and in your evenings, not only will affect your pilgrimage, but the pilgrimage of others around you, and eventually your spouse and your children after you. So I encourage you to think the issue out. Do not be discouraged. Remember 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. God will not suffer you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but He will, with the temptation, provide a way of escape. So be realistic, be encouraged, and be good.
None of us is exempt from temptation. You're listening to Truth for Life Weekend. That is Alistair Begg offering biblical counsel on how we deal with temptation. If you'd like to share today's message with someone, it's easy to do. Go to the Truth for Life website or use our mobile app. Select the share icon and you can pass them a link for free. Today's message is simply titled Temptation. In fact, you can download and share all of the messages in this series titled Lessons for Life. We're currently in Volume 1, but you can download all 4 volumes without cost. You'll find the complete study on our website at truthforlife.org. At Truth for Life, we're always looking for more ways to help you become established in your faith and help you share what you've learned with others. We have many online resources that you can access or share for free. For example, you can watch or listen to thousands of Alistair's messages. You can read articles we post each week, sign up for daily devotionals written by Alistair or by Charles Spurgeon. You can even download study guides without cost. You'll find all of this and more in the Truth for Life mobile app or on our website at truthforlife.org. I'm Bob Lepine. Thanks for including us in your weekend. In a world full of so many wonderful distractions and exciting opportunities, how can we stay focused on God's purpose for us? Join us again next weekend to hear the answer. The Bible teaching of Alistair Begg is furnished by Truth for Life, where the learning is for living.